Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping aboard a rotting ship where the wind cuts through your bones like a blade and the sea spray freezes before your face. You're about to discover how medieval pirates, those brutal men who terrorized coastlines across Europe, somehow managed to survive the most bone-chilling nights imaginable while trapped on wooden vessels in the middle of frozen seas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm blanket, and let's sail into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a medieval pirate ship in the dead of winter somewhere off the coast of Scotland. The year is 1347. The wind howls like a banshee through the rigging, and every breath you take burns your lungs with cold so sharp it feels like swallowing glass. Ice forms on the ropes faster than you can scrape it off. Your fingers are so numb you can barely grip your sword, and the planks beneath your feet are slick with frost that never melts. This isn't some romanticized Pirates of the Caribbean adventure. This is survival at its most brutal. These men didn't have heat irons or thick wintered cab coats or even proper bedding. They had nothing but their wits, their cruelty, and a few tricks that meant the difference between waking up alive or becoming another frozen corpse tossed overboard at dawn. Medieval pirates faced winters that would kill modern sailors equipped with the best gear money can buy. Yet somehow, these ruthless sea wolves found ways to endure nights so cold that water froze in their beards and their breath turned to ice crystals before leaving their mouths. Tonight, I'm going to reveal exactly how they did it. But first, let me tell you why this matters. Understanding how medieval pirates survived isn't just about satisfying curiosity. These techniques were born from pure desperation, refined through generations of trial and error, and perfected by men who literally could not afford to get it wrong. One mistake meant death, and dead pirates don't collect treasure. The methods they developed were so effective that some are still used by survival experts today. Others were so brutal and disturbing that they've been forgotten entirely, buried in the darkest corners of maritime history. But all of them worked, and that's what makes this story so compelling. You see, when most people think about pirates, they imagine sun-soaked Caribbean islands and warm tropical breezes. But the reality is that medieval piracy thrived in the harsh northern waters of Europe. The English Channel, the North Sea, the Baltic. These were hunting grounds where winter temperatures could drop well below freezing and storms could last for weeks. Pirates who operated in these waters weren't just fighting other ships. They were fighting the sea itself, and the sea wanted them dead. Every single night was a battle against hypothermia, frostbite, and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. So, how did they do it? How did men with nothing but stolen clothes and makeshift equipment survive in conditions that would challenge even modern survival experts? The answer lies in three key strategies that every successful pirate crew had to master: body heat conservation, shared warmth techniques, and what I call the Pi protocol rate fire? Let's start with body heat conservation because this was literally life or death. Medieval pirates understood something that many people today have forgotten. Your body is constantly producing heat, but it's also constantly losing it. The trick isn't just to generate more warmth, it's to stop that heat from escaping. Pirates developed a layering system that was both ingenious and terrifying. They would strip the clothes off their victims, not just for value, but because multiple layers of stolen garments could mean the difference between survival and death. A typical pirate might wear 4 or 5 different shirts, 3 pairs of pants, and whatever cloaks or coats they could acquire. But here's where it gets. They, interesting, didn't just throw these clothes on randomly. Pirates learned to layer strategically, with the finest fabrics closest to their skin and the roughest, most wind-resistant materials on the outside. Silk shirts stolen from wealthy merchants went against the body, while thick wool cloaks taken from monasteries formed the outer shell. They also discovered that certain materials held heat better when wet. Wool, even when soaked with sea spray, retained insulating properties that could keep a man alive. Cotton, on the other hand, became a death trap when wet, sucking heat from the body faster than it could be produced. Pirates quickly learned which fabrics to seek and which to avoid. The extremities were always the biggest challenge. Hands and feet would go numb first, and once frostbite set in, a pirate's fighting days were over. So they developed crude but effective solutions. They would wrap their hands in strips of leather or cloth, then coat these wrappings with fat or whale oil when available. This created a waterproof barrier that trapped heat while keeping moisture out. For their feet, pirates often wore multiple pairs of stockings stuffed inside boots that were deliberately oversized. The air trapped between the layers provided insulation, while the loose fit allowed blood to circulate properly. Some crews even shared boots, rotating them among the men so that no one's feet stayed cold for too long. But individual heat conservation was only the first line of defense. The real secret to pirate survival lay in their mastery of shared warmth techniques. And this is where things get both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Medieval pirate ships were cramped, filthy, and overcrowded. But these conditions actually worked in their favor during winter months. Pirates would create what they called warming huddles, essentially human piles where multiple men would press together to share body heat. These weren't comfortable arrangements. Men would lie on top of each other, limbs intertwined, breath mixing in clouds of steam. The hierarchy of the crew determined who got the warmest spots. The captain and his closest allies claimed the center of these human heaps, where body heat was most concentrated. Lower-ranking pirates were relegated to the edges, where they served as insulation for those more important than themselves. It was brutal, but it kept the core crew alive. Pirates also learned to time these warming sessions strategically. They would huddle together during the coldest parts of the night, usually between midnight and dawn, then separate during the day when sunlight and physical activity could provide additional heat. This rhythm became so ingrained that experienced pirates could sense when it was time to gather without any verbal communication. But shared warmth went beyond just pressing bodies together. Pirates developed elaborate sleeping arrangements designed to maximize heat retention across the entire crew. They would create communal sleeping areas using stolen sails, cargo nets, and rope to fashion crude but effective shelters. These makeshift quarters were often built in the most protected parts of the ship, typically below deck in cargo holds or storage areas. Inside these communal spaces, pirates would arrange themselves like spokes on a wheel, with their feet pointing toward the center and their heads toward the outside. This configuration allowed them to share the warmth from their core bodies while keeping their extremities from freezing. They would cover the entire group with whatever materials they had available, creating a single large blanket that trapped heat from multiple sources. The most successful pirate crews took this even further. They would designate certain men as heat guardians, individuals whose job was to stay awake and monitor the temperature of the sleeping crew. These guardians would rotate positions, adding or removing coverings as needed, and would wake anyone who showed signs of hypothermia or frostbite. Some crews even developed a rotation system where men would take turns being the outer layer of insulation, sacrificing their own comfort for the survival of the group. This might sound noble, but it wasn't altruism. Pirates understood that a crew with dead or frost-bitten members was a weak crew, and weak crews didn't survive long enough to enjoy their plunder. The third crucial element of pirate winter survival was what I call the Pirate Fire Protocol, and this is where their ingenuity really shines through. You might think that lighting fires on wooden ships would be impossible or incredibly dangerous, and you'd be mostly right. But pirates found ways to harness fire's warmth while minimizing the risk of burning their vessels to the waterline. The key was controlled, temporary heat sources that could warm the crew without endangering the ship. Pirates would create small fire pits using metal containers stolen from their victims. Cooking pots, armor pieces, even helmets could be repurposed as miniature braziers. These would be filled pieces of wood and with charcoal or smald, lit only when absolutely necessary. The timing and location of these fires was critical. Pirates would typically light them during the coldest parts of the night, usually in the most sheltered areas of the ship where wind couldn't spread flames or sparks. They would surround the fire pit with wet cloth or sand to contain any embers, and always kept buckets of seawater nearby for emergencies. But the real genius was in how they used these fires. Rather than trying to warm themselves directly, which would have required keeping the flames burning for hours, pirates developed a heating stone system. They would heat rocks, metal objects, or even cannonballs in their fires, then wrap these heated items in cloth and use them as portable heat sources. These heated objects could provide warmth for hours without any ongoing fire risk. Pirates would tuck them inside their clothing, press them against their feet, or use them to warm their sleeping areas before the communal huddles began. A single heated stone could keep a man's core temperature stable through an entire night, and multiple heated objects could create pockets of warmth throughout the ship. The most experienced crews would even create heating chains, where heated objects would be passed from man to man throughout the night. As one stone cooled down, it would be replaced with a freshly warmed one, creating a continuous cycle of portable heat that could sustain an entire crew through the worst winter storms. But fire wasn't just about warmth. Pirates discovered that certain materials, when burned, produced smoke that could actually help preserve body heat. Whale oil, when available, created a thick, oily smoke that would cling to clothing and skin, forming an additional insulating layer. This smoke was toxic and foul-smelling, but it worked. Pirates would deliberately expose themselves to these fumes, knowing that the temporary discomfort could prevent hypothermia. Now, here's where pirate survival gets truly dark. And I need to warn you that what I'm about to describe is disturbing. Medieval pirates weren't bound by the moral constraints that governed legitimate sailors. When their own heat conservation methods weren't enough, they would turn to what can only be described as horrific improvisation. Pirates would use the bodies of the dead as heat sources. When a crew member died from cold, disease, or injury, his body would be kept aboard for as long as possible. The recently deceased retained body heat for hours after death, and desperate pirates would press against these corpses to absorb their remaining warmth. It's a ghastly thought, but in the brutal calculus of survival, a dead man's heat could keep 3 living men alive through a killing frost. They would also harvest body parts for insulation. Human fat, when rendered properly, could be used to waterproof clothing or create primitive heating fuel. Hair could be stuffed into boots or gloves for additional insulation. Even bones could be hollowed out and used as containers for heated oil or melted snow. Some crews practiced what they called blood warming, where they would deliberately wound themselves or their captives to create fresh blood that could be used to warm frozen extremities. The iron-rich blood would be rubbed on hands and feet that had lost sensation, supposedly helping to restore circulation. Whether this actually worked is debatable, but pirates believed in it enough to continue the practice. But perhaps the most disturbing technique was the use of living captives as human heat sources. Wealthy prisoners who were being held for ransom would be forced to serve as living blankets for the crew. These unfortunate souls would be stripped naked and made to lie against cold pirates, their body heat stolen while they slowly froze to death. It was both practical and psychological torture designed to break the spirit while serving a functional purpose. Pirates also developed a technique they called the warming sacrifice. When supplies ran low and the crew was facing death from exposure, they would select the weakest or most expendable members and force them to remain on deck throughout the night. These doomed men would absorb the worst of the cold, wind, and spray, while the rest of the crew huddled in relative warmth below. By morning, the sacrificed pirates would be dead or dying, but their suffering had bought survival for the others. These methods reveal the fundamental difference between medieval pirates and legitimate sailors. Naval crews, bound by discipline and Christian morality, would try to keep everyone alive even at great cost to the group. Pirates operated under no such constraints. They would sacrifice anyone and everyone if it meant the core crew could survive to fight another day. The psychological toll of these survival techniques cannot be understated. Men who spent months using corpses for warmth, torturing prisoners for body heat, and sacrificing their own crew members to the cold were fundamentally changed by the experience. Many pirates who survived brutal winters became increasingly detached from normal human emotions, viewing other people as nothing more than resources to be exploited. But beyond these horrific improvisations, pirates also developed more conventional survival strategies that were actually quite sophisticated. They became masters of reading weather patterns, learning to predict when the worst cold snaps would hit, and preparing accordingly. Experienced pirates could sense a killing frost hours before it arrived, giving the crew time to implement their warming protocols. Pirates would also create microclimates within their ships using clever engineering. They would hang stolen tapestries or sails to create windbreaks, redirecting airflow to protect sleeping areas from the worst drafts. They would stuff gaps between planks with cloth, rope, or even human hair to eliminate cold air infiltration. Some crews would even create false walls using cargo or stolen furniture, creating smaller, more easily heated spaces within the larger ship. Food played a crucial role in their survival strategy as well. Pirates understood that the body needed fuel to generate heat, so they would carefully ration high-energy foods during the coldest periods. Stolen alcohol was particularly prized not just for its warming sensation, but because it actually dilated blood vessels and improved circulation to extremities. They would also practice what we might now recognize as primitive thermogenesis. Pirates would engage in sudden, intense physical activity to generate body heat quickly. This might involve violent sword matches or even staged drills, wrestling fights between crew members. The adrenaline and physical exertion would spike their core temperature, providing temporary relief from the cold. The most successful pirate crews developed elaborate schedules that balanced activity with rest, ensuring that men were generating heat through movement during the day and conserving it through communal warming at night. This rhythm became so ingrained that veteran pirates could maintain their body temperature even in extreme conditions through careful management of their energy and warmth resources. But here's what makes this entire system so remarkable. These weren't educated men working from scientific principles. These were violent, often illiterate criminals who developed these techniques through pure trial and error. Every method they used was paid for in blood, tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and refined through generations of desperate experimentation. The pirates who mastered these survival techniques became legendary figures, men who could operate in conditions that would kill ordinary sailors. They weren't just feared for their cruelty in battle, but for their supernatural ability to survive winters that claimed entire naval fleets. This reputation for invincibility in harsh conditions became part of their psychological warfare, striking fear into the hearts of merchants and naval officers who knew that neither weather nor season could stop these sea wolves. And the truly terrifying part is that it worked. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and historical records show that pirate crews operating in northern European waters had remarkably high survival rates during winter months, often outlasting legitimate naval expeditions that were better equipped and supplied. Their willingness to abandon human decency in favor of pure survival gave them an edge that no amount of proper equipment could match. These survival techniques weren't just individual skills, they were passed down through generations of pirates like deadly family recipes. Young men who joined pirate crews didn't learn swordsmanship first. They learned how to stay alive when the sea tried to freeze them solid. Veterans would take new recruits aside during their first winter voyage and teach them the subtle art of staying warm when warmth meant the difference between collecting treasure and becoming fish food. The teaching process was brutal but effective. New pirates would be deliberately exposed to increasingly harsh conditions, while experienced crew members watched for signs of hypothermia or panic. Those who broke under the pressure were either abandoned at the next port or thrown overboard. Those who adapted became part of the brotherhood, inheritors of centuries of accumulated survival wisdom. But these techniques came with a price that went beyond physical suffering. Pirates who survived multiple winter seasons using these methods developed recognized as severe psychological, what we might now trauma. They became capable of viewing human life as nothing more than a commodity, a heat source to be exploited or discarded as circumstances demanded. The most experienced winter survivors often became the most feared captains, not because they were the best fighters, but because they possessed an inhuman coldness that matched the seas they sailed. These men could make decisions that would horrify normal people without the slightest hesitation, viewing crew members, captives, and even allies as expendable resources in the endless battle against the elements. This psychological transformation wasn't accidental. The harsh realities of winter survival at sea created a natural selection process that favored the most ruthless individuals. Pirates who retained too much human compassion didn't last long when faced with decisions about who would live and who would die during the coldest nights of the year. The ships themselves became laboratories for survival innovation. Pirates would modify their vessels specifically for winter operations, creating hidden compartments where the crew could huddle during the worst weather. These modifications were often crude but ingenious, using stolen materials and salvaged equipment to create spaces that could trap and retain heat more effectively than the original ship design. They would also develop mobile heating systems, portable braziers that could be moved throughout the ship as conditions changed. These devices were carefully designed to provide maximum heat while minimizing fire risk, often incorporating elaborate ventilation systems made from hollow bones or metal tubes that could direct smoke away from sleeping areas. The most innovative crews created what they called heat banks, areas of the ship where thermal energy could be stored and released gradually throughout the night. They would heat stones during the day using focused sunlight or small fires, then move these heated objects to insulated storage areas where they could slowly release their warmth over many hours. Pirates also became masters of psychological warmth, understanding that the mind's perception of temperature could be just as important as actual body heat. They would tell stories, sing songs, and engage in activities that created the mental impression of warmth even when their bodies were freezing. This wasn't just distraction, it was a deliberate technique to prevent the psychological collapse that often preceded physical death from exposure. The most successful captains learned to read the mental state of their crews as they read the weather. They could as carefully sense when men were approaching their breaking point and would implement warming protocols before panic set in. This early intervention often meant the difference between a crew that survived the winter and one that descended into madness and cannibalism. But the true genius of pirate winter survival lay in their understanding of energy conservation. These men learned to minimize unnecessary movement during the coldest periods, entering almost hibernation-like states where they would remain motionless for hours at a time. They would synchronize their breathing, slow their heart rates, and enter collective trances that reduce metabolic needs there while maximizing heat retention. This group hibernation wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. Pirates would enter shared mental states where individual consciousness seemed to merge with the collective will to survive. Men would report later that they experienced shared dreams, collective visions, and a loss of individual identity that helped them endure conditions that would have broken them if faced alone. The timing of these hibernation periods was crucial. Pirates learned to enter these states during the deepest part of the night when temperatures reached their lowest point, then emerge as dawn approached and the possibility of activity could help generate heat through movement. This rhythm became so ingrained that veteran pirates could slip into hibernation states almost instantly when conditions demanded it. Food rationing during these survival periods followed principles that were both practical and ritualistic. Pirates understood that certain foods generated more body heat than others, and they would carefully allocate these high-energy rations during the coldest nights. But the distribution of food also served a psychological purpose, reinforcing the crew's hierarchy and providing a sense of structure when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The most prized foods during winter voyages were those that provided both nutrition and warmth. Stolen spices, when available, were worth more than gold because they could stimulate circulation and create the sensation of internal heat. Pirates would hoard pepper, cinnamon, and other warming spices like precious medicines, doling them out in tiny quantities during the worst weather. They also discovered that certain combinations of foods could enhance the body's natural heat production. Mixing stolen honey with strong alcohol created a substance that not only provided immediate warmth, but also sustained energy release over several hours. This mixture became known among pirates as liquid fire, and recipes for the most effective versions were closely guarded secrets passed down through generations of crews. The preparation and consumption of food during winter survival became ritualized activities that served multiple purposes. The act of preparing meals provided necessary movement to generate heat, while the communal consumption reinforced social bonds that were essential for group survival. Even the simplest meal became an opportunity to share warmth, with pirates pressing close together around their meager rations. Water management presented its own unique challenges during winter voyages. Fresh water would freeze solid in containers, making it impossible to drink and potentially deadly to consume in its frozen state. Pirates developed techniques for melting ice and snow using body heat, often keeping chunks of frozen water inside their clothing where it could slowly melt without requiring precious fuel for fires. They also learned to harvest moisture from their own breath and the condensation that formed inside their sleeping areas. This water recovery wasn't just practical, it was essential for survival, since dehydration could be just as deadly as freezing. Pirates would use cloth strips to collect condensed water vapor, then carefully manage this precious resource to maintain proper hydration levels throughout the crew. The most experienced crews developed elaborate water rationing systems that accounted for the increased fluid needs during cold weather. They understood that the body required more water to function properly in extreme cold, and they would adjust their consumption accordingly. This knowledge often came at a terrible cost, learned through watching crew members die from dehydration that masqueraded as hypothermia. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of pirate winter survival was their ability to maintain fighting effectiveness even under the most brutal conditions. These weren't just men trying to stay alive. They were predators who needed to remain capable of violence even when their bodies were pushed to the absolute limits of endurance. Pirates developed combat techniques specifically adapted for cold weather conditions. They learned to fight with numb fingers, limited mobility, and reduced reaction times. They practiced weapon handling while wearing multiple layers of stolen clothing, and they developed tactics that could be executed even when visibility was reduced by snow, ice, or the fog of frozen breath. The most successful winter pirates became legendary for their ability to attack merchant vessels during storms and blizzards when their targets least expected it. They would emerge from seemingly impossible weather conditions like vengeful spirits, their survival techniques allowing them to operate when ordinary sailors could barely stand upright on deck. These cold weather raids required precise timing and extraordinary physical conditioning. Pirates would prepare for attacks by warming their bodies using their heat conservation techniques, then strike quickly before the cold could sap their strength. They would board enemy vessels like frozen demons, their faces covered in ice, their movements driven by desperate ferocity, born from months of survival at the edge of death. The psychological impact of these winter attacks cannot be overstated. Merchant sailors who witnessed pirates emerging from killing storms, apparently unaffected by conditions that had their own crews cowering below deck, often surrendered immediately rather than fight what seemed like supernatural enemies. This reputation for invincibility in harsh weather became one of the pirates' most effective weapons. But maintaining this fighting edge during the winter required constant vigilance and preparation. Pirates would practice combat drills even during the worst weather, forcing themselves to move and fight when every instinct screamed for them to huddle motionless in whatever warmth they could find. These training sessions served multiple purposes, keeping their skills sharp while generating the body heat necessary for survival. The weapons themselves required special attention during winter voyages. Metal blades would become brittle in extreme cold, and pirates learned to keep their swords and daggers warm by storing them close to their bodies. They would wrap weapon hilts with cloth or leather to prevent their hands from freezing to the metal, and they developed quick-draw techniques that could be executed while wearing thick gloves or mittens. Pirates also discovered that certain weapons performed better in cold conditions than others. Axes and clubs remained effective when swords became too brittle to trust, and many winter pirates preferred these blunt weapons for their reliability in extreme weather. They would modify their favorite weapons specifically for cold weather use, adding grips that could be held securely with numb fingers and weights that could generate maximum impact, even when wielded by weakened arms. The maintenance of equipment during winter voyages became a matter of life and death. Pirates would spend hours each day caring for their weapons, tools, and ship components, using techniques that prevented ice formation and metal fatigue. This wasn't just practical maintenance, it was a survival ritual that kept their hands moving and their minds focused during the long, brutal nights. The ship's rigging became a deadly maze during winter months, and pirates had to navigate it while battling conditions that could kill them in minutes. Ice would form on every rope, every sail, every piece of metal, creating a crystalline death trap that required constant attention. Pirates learned to move through this frozen landscape with a careful, deliberate rhythm that conserved energy while preventing fatal slips. They developed techniques for breaking ice formations without damaging the ship's structure, using heated metal tools when possible, or their own body heat when nothing else was available. Pirates would methodically clear ice from critical areas. This wasn't just maintenance, it was warfare against the elements, a daily battle that determined whether the ship remained seaworthy or became a floating tomb. The most experienced crews created ice management schedules, with different men assigned to monitor specific areas of the ship throughout the night. They understood that ice formation followed predictable patterns, and they could prevent dangerous accumulations by intervening at the right moments. This knowledge was earned through years of observation, watching ships become unmanageable as ice weight shifted their balance or tore their sails to shreds. Pirates also learned to read ice formations like a language, interpreting the patterns to predict weather changes and wind shifts. Certain types of ice crystals indicated approaching storms, while other formations suggested temporary warming periods that could be exploited for essential ship maintenance. This ice literacy became as important as reading stars or ocean currents for navigation. The psychological warfare of winter survival extended beyond the crew to their victims as well. Pirates discovered that merchant ships caught in winter storms were more likely to surrender quickly, their crews already demoralized by the brutal conditions. The sight of pirates who seemed unaffected by weather that had their targets barely functional was often enough to end conflicts before they began. But this psychological advantage came with its own costs. Pirates who spent too many winters at sea often developed what we might now recognize as severe mental disorders. The constant stress of survival, combined with the brutal decisions required to stay alive, created men who were as dangerous to their own crews as they were to their enemies. These winter-hardened pirates became walking weapons, their humanity eroded by years of choosing survival over compassion. The most feared captains were those who had survived the most winters, their reputations built not just on successful raids, but on their ability to bring crews through conditions that killed ordinary men. These legendary figures commanded absolute loyalty through a combination of survival expertise and barely controlled madness, their crews following them because they knew no one else could keep them alive in the frozen hell of winter seas. Sleep during winter voyages became a carefully orchestrated survival strategy rather than simple rest. Pirates would arrange themselves in specific formations designed to maximize heat retention while maintaining the ability to respond quickly to emergencies. The most vulnerable members of the crew would be placed in the center of these human clusters, while the hardiest veterans formed protective outer layers. They developed sleep schedules that accounted for the body's natural temperature fluctuations throughout the night. Pirates learned to sleep most deeply during the warmest periods, usually just after sunset, when residual heat from the day still lingered. Then enter lighter sleep states during the dangerous pre-dawn hours when hypothermia was most likely to claim victims. The communal sleeping arrangements required elaborate social protocols to prevent conflicts that could be deadly in such close quarters. Pirates established strict rules about movement, noise, and personal space during these survival huddles. Violations of these protocols could result in expulsion from the warm center of the group, which was often equivalent to a death sentence. They also developed techniques for monitoring each other's condition throughout the night without fully waking. Pirates would learn to recognize the breathing patterns, body temperature, and movement of their sleeping companions, allowing them to detect hypothermia or other medical emergencies before they became fatal. This collective vigilance saved countless lives during the worst winter storms. The most innovative crews created rotating body heat systems where men would take turns being the warmest and coldest members of the sleeping group. This prevented any individual from becoming dangerously chilled while ensuring that the core group maintained sufficient warmth to survive. The rotation schedules were carefully calculated based on each man's size, health, and cold tolerance. Dreams during these communal sleeping periods often became shared experiences with multiple pirates reporting similar visions or nightmares. Whether this was due to shared physical conditions, psychological stress, or some other factor, these collective dreams became part of pirate folklore. Some crews believed that shared dreams were omens, either good or bad, that could predict the success of future raids, or the approach of deadly storms. The transition from sleep to wakefulness required careful management to prevent shock that could stop a man's heart. Pirates learned to wake slowly and gradually, allowing their bodies to adjust to movement after hours of enforced stillness. They would begin with small finger and toe movements, gradually increasing activity until full mobility returned. Food consumption during the winter months followed strict protocols designed to maximize caloric efficiency while maintaining crew morale. Pirates understood that hunger weakened the body's ability to generate heat, but they also knew that food supplies were limited and had to be carefully rationed. They developed sophisticated systems for calculating how much food each man needed to maintain his body temperature while ensuring that supplies would last through the entire voyage. The preparation of meals became elaborate rituals that served multiple survival functions. The act of cooking provided essential heat. The communal consumption reinforced social bonds, and the careful distribution of rations maintained crew discipline. Even the simplest meal became an opportunity for survival strategy, with pirates clustering around cooking fires and sharing the warmth generated by food preparation. They discovered that certain cooking methods generated more heat than others, and they would adjust their food preparation techniques based on weather conditions. During the coldest nights, pirates would deliberately choose cooking methods that required more time and fuel, not because the food needed it, but because the extended cooking process provided precious additional warmth for the crew. Spices not and seasonings became valuable just for flavor, but for their thermogenic properties. Pirates would trade weapons and treasure for pepper, ginger, and other warming spices that could stimulate circulation and create internal heat. The most knowledgeable crews developed elaborate spice combinations that maximized warming effects while making their limited food supplies more palatable. The storage and preservation of food during winter voyages required techniques that prevented spoilage while maintaining nutritional value. Pirates learned to use the cold to their advantage, creating natural refrigeration systems that kept food fresh longer than would have been possible in warmer climates. They would bury supplies in snow or ice, creating caches that could sustain the crew through extended periods of bad weather. But food wasn't just about nutrition during winter survival. Pirates discovered that the act of chewing and digestion generated internal heat that could help maintain core body temperature. They would encourage crew members to chew and thoroughly, note slowly just to aid digestion, but to maximize the warming effects of eating. The most successful winter pirates became master scroungers, able to find edible materials in the most unlikely places. They would harvest seaweed, catch fish through holes in the ice, and even eat leather or rope when necessary. This ability to find sustenance where others saw nothing became legendary among pirate crews, with the most resourceful captains attracting followers based on their reputation for keeping men fed during impossible conditions. Water remained a constant challenge during winter voyages, requiring innovative solutions that went beyond simple ice melting. Pirates developed techniques for creating drinking water from seawater using primitive distillation methods, often powered by the same fires they used for warmth. These distillation systems were crude but effective, providing fresh water when ice and snow were unavailable. So there you have it, the brutal, ingenious, and often horrifying ways that medieval pirates survived the coldest nights at sea. From their strategic layering systems and communal warming huddles to their controlled fire protocols and psychological hibernation techniques, these men developed survival methods that were as effective as they were ruthless. Their willingness to abandon human decency in favor of pure survival gave them an edge that no amount of proper equipment could match. These weren't just criminals. They were apex survivors who conquered the most hostile environment on Earth through sheer determination and calculated brutality. The next time you're struggling with a cold night in your warm bed, remember these frozen sea wolves who turned winter itself into just another enemy to be defeated. Thanks for joining me on this chilling journey into maritime survival, and I'll see you in the next one.